Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And things went well here in the 2040 season with Oakland. 106-56 record was the best record in baseball. And even more importantly than that, we had some good success in the postseason this time, winning the Fall Classic for the third time in the past 5 years and the fourth time overall. Perhaps even more exciting to me was that our fan loyalty, which had been minimal for well over a decade at this point, has finally moved up to pathetic. So we are pathetic now in Oakland, and we're viewing it as a victory, which says a lot about the budgetary situation here in Oakland. This upcoming 2041 season will be running with a budget of $194 million. Unfortunately for us, Mr. Fisher cut our budget for next year by $4 million, despite a 106-win season and a World Series title. So still a challenge here in 2040 for the good fans in Oakland, with John Fisher still owning the franchise. And in this episode, we will do our annual roster review, see exactly how everyone on the team ended up performing in this 2040 championship season. Was a great season on the field for Oakland, as I mentioned, the 106-56 record, the best in baseball. And that was actually 5 games worse than Pythagorean expectations. We were expected to be a 111-win club. We had a winning percentage of 600 or better every month of the season, so we were consistently excellent. Ended up first in the American League with 991 runs scored, the biggest total we've ever had here in Oakland. And we were first, second, or third in every significant offensive and base running category, except for home runs, where we were 7th, so middle of the pack, basically, in the American League. The pitching was also exceptional, first in the American League in runs allowed, and we were first or third in every primary pitching category except for strikeouts, where we ranked 6th. We also had the best defensive efficiency and the best zone rating of any team in the American League. So it was, when all was said and done, an outstanding season for our Oakland A's. And we're heading into an offseason where we're perhaps going to have more turnover from this team than we've ever had before. A couple of huge free agents who have been a big part of our last 3 championships, both almost certainly going to leave us. And we also have some pretty significant players that we may need to also try to trade away over the next several weeks to kind of get the budget in a better situation. As I mentioned, the $4 million budget cut, in addition to a payroll that has continued to expand, puts us in a situation where right now we've basically got well below the league baseline to potentially invest in both scouting and player development. Normally we invest pretty heavily in both of those areas, so we will be looking to cut some payroll over the next few weeks and few months, most likely. We'll take a look at our outstanding pitching staff first. Our ace, Jesus Saldana, finished the year 14-5 with a 3.99 ERA, although his WAR was significantly down from where it had been the last couple seasons. Although the 14 wins are the second most in his career, the 2.8 WAR is by far the lowest that Saldana's ever put up over the course of his career. That being said, he got off to an 0-4 in 2-5 start. So after that 2-5 start, he won 12 consecutive decisions to close out the season, lowering his ERA significantly in the process. Saldana signed for the next 4 to 6 years at pretty reasonable amounts if he continues to be as productive as he has been thus far. Speaking of productive, Doug Weiss, who we drafted in the 4th round out of Austin Peay as a reliever that we fortunately have been able to turn into a starter by expanding his repertoire, led the American League with 21 wins, 21-3 record, 2.99 ERA, and a 5.4 WAR for Mr. Weiss. the best season of his career. He is set to make about $12 million next year. Our hope is that we will be able to bring him back, given that he's fragile and he also knows his value. He's probably nearing the end of his tenure with Oakland. But I think even though we are going to be moving on from several key players this offseason, there is a path to keep Mr. Weiss on board while also getting our finances in better order. And I think that's certainly the path that we will try to pursue, given that Weiss is arguably the most talented starting pitcher on our team. Chase Dora is one of the guys that we may almost certainly be moving on from. The 32-year-old veteran, only 9-7 this year. The ERA increased to 4.30, put up a WAR of close to 3. Dora, who we picked up in a big trade with Cincinnati 4.5 years ago, all he's done with us is win 3 World Series in the 4.5 years that he's been on the team. Led the league in both wins and ERA 2 years ago. The only reason we were able to afford him was that Cincinnati retained a good chunk of his contract because we sent the excellent outfielder Brady Harris and others to Cincinnati to bring him on board. His time with us almost certainly coming to an end at this point, looking for 4 years at over $23 million a season. So given that we've got a lot of good, young, less expensive pitchers than Dora in the organization, he is someone that we will almost certainly be moving on for. Think we can probably give him a QO and hopefully pick up a pick in return for his departure. Our lone lefty in the rotation, Mike Blumenshine, who we drafted out of Brown 4 years ago, 11-5 with a 3.46 ERA this year, 1.7 WAR on the season. Nice bounce back year for him from an injury-plagued rookie season where he was not particularly effective at the major league level. Blumenshine is a guy that we signed to a front-loaded contract, so his numbers are going to be coming down over the next few years, although he's probably not as high-end a pitcher as either Saldana or Weiss, given that he's a lefty and given that he is signed to what we hope will be a very reasonable contract. Blumenshine likely to be an important part of our rotation going forward as well. The toughest year of any of our starters this year was the young right-hander Dave Baumler. Won 13 games for us a year ago, slipped to 8-9 this year. His ERA climbed, gave up more homers, walked more batters, obviously allowed more hits, and his whip was higher. He walked more batters, struck out fewer batters, ERA plus, FIP minus, both worse than a year ago, and his WAR was only 1.5. That being said, Baumler is the only captain personality that we have on the team, and he's still going to be making the major league minimum next year. So he will certainly be back with us, and given that we want that captain personality in the clubhouse, we'll almost certainly have Baumler written in pen as our number 5 starter for next season. Turning to the bullpen, we've got some big-time performers here as well. The left-handed closer Chuck Huntley, 4-4 record, saved 33 games for the second straight year, dropped his ERA to 2.98 and put up a 2+ WAR for us. Starting to get a bit expensive, going to be making around $6 million next year, but he is extremely popular locally and a very effective pitcher. I could definitely see us keeping Mr. Huntley around. Jake Mendick, a lefty that we added in a trade with Arizona just about a year ago, 8-3 record, 28 shutdowns to 12 meltdowns, and an ERA of 2.41 for us. Gave up more home runs than we would have expected, but still was a nice solid pitcher for us out of the pen. Another guy who's arbitration eligible, going to be making $3.5-4 million next year. I think Mendick will likely be back as well. A couple of guys that we could look to trade this offseason, though. Mike Gallick, we picked him up in a trade with Boston right before the trade deadline. He, similar to Weiss, is arbitration eligible, set to make about $10 million next year. Weiss has been with us longer, although Gallic is a fan favorite and pretty popular. Wasn't incredibly good this season. Had an ERA of over 5 as a starter with Boston. With us, he cut the ERA down to 3.74. Still gave up 7 home runs in 43 and a third innings, and still had a 3-6 record with as many meltdowns as he had shutdowns. His WAR was barely above replacement level with us, and given that we need to pare some contracts back, Gallic is a guy that we might be looking to move on from. Another guy that we could be looking to move on from is Mike Orozco. This is a guy that we have signed to a somewhat front-loaded contract, but still making pretty good money for a reliever. 29-year-old is now wrecked physically. We have worked him hard since we brought him on board. He's led the American League in games every year that he's been with us. But a 4.54 ERA, his WAR down to 1.3, ERA plus below the league average on this year. Given that he's going to be turning 30 around playoff time next season, he's wrecked physically and he's making pretty good money. And he does still have pretty good trade value because the contract is not unreasonable for a guy with outstanding stuff and a world-class sinker, as well as the stamina where he could actually start for some teams if they're okay with that third pitch being a below-average splitter. Similar to Gallic, Orozco has some value, and we may look to harvest some of that value in the trade market going forward as we try to get the finances for the A's back in order. Righty Jonathan Shearer will likely be back. He also is arbitration eligible, but the number is only going to be 1.3, 1.4 million. Shearer is a right-hander out of the pen for us this year, had a 2 ERA over 45 innings pitched. 2 straight years for him with a sub-3 ERA. Only pitched 45 innings, and you would think with the departures of potentially Orozco and Gallic that we may ask Shearer to be doing a little bit more for us next year, and confident that he can handle that. Part of the reason that we're potentially willing to move on from a couple of top-notch starters in Dora and Gallic, as well as a big-time reliever in Orozco, is that we've got 2 other excellent young pitchers who could certainly fit in the rotation for us. Federico Arriola split the year between AAA and the majors, was a combined 15-2 at both levels, 3.74 ERA with a WAR of over 1 here in the majors, still listed as the number 23 prospect in baseball for the youngster who's only 23 years old that we drafted in the second round as a high school pitcher 6 years ago. Arriola's definitely developed the way that we would have hoped. Similarly, Ernesto Comunez, an international free agent signing almost 6 years ago at this point. Spent the entire year with the big club, although he started only 1 game. 6-1 record with a 3.65 ERA over 79 innings pitched. He's a guy that we've signed to a somewhat front-loaded contract, so his numbers are going to be getting more reasonable going forward. I would put him more into the Baumler Blumenshine mix than Saldana and Weiss. I think that you could argue that Arriola's probably got better stuff and should be competing with Saldana and Weiss to be at the top of the rotation. But I think with Blumenshine, Baumler, and Comunez, we've got potentially 6 starters for 5 spots. So even if we let Dora and Gallic move on, going to really like the depth of our rotation, and we're going to have a pretty darn good pitcher working out of the pen as an insurance policy for us. Lefty Kevin Carmichael, a player that we picked up in a trade with Toronto 2 years ago, had a 3.22 ERA for us over 44 2/3 innings. Walked a lot more batters than we would have hoped this year. Was barely above replacement level. Only set to be making about $2 million next year. And I think we're probably leaning towards bringing Carmichael back. Huntley, Mendick, and Carmichael as 3 lefties in the bullpen, I think can potentially be outstanding for us. Daniel Blanco, right-handed reliever, 27-year-old, who's come up through our organization, ninth-round pick in 2032, who's done really well. Had a rough year this year, 4.50 ERA over 32 innings in the majors. Also ended up spending some time in Las Vegas in AAA rehabbing. Had a couple of stints on the IL. Still was above a replacement level player. He also signed one of those front-loaded contracts, so his numbers are getting more reasonable in the next few years. But at $5 million next year, could be a guy that we look to move on from. One of the many reasons we can move on potentially from Blanco is another lefty that's coming up in the pen, Luis Aguayo, 14th round pick a couple of years ago, who has just blossomed into someone that we think can be an absolutely devastating left-handed arm out of the bullpen. Over his first 4 2/3 innings of Major League Ball in September, Aguayo struck out 10 batters, and you can see he got better as the competition got harder each year. 13.8 strikeouts per nine in Double-A this year, up to 15.2 in Triple-A, and a ridiculous 19.3 strikeouts per nine inning in the very small sample size that he's had with us in the majors. But certainly adding a player like Aguayo into the bullpen would potentially give us 4 lefties that we really like. You would think that Scherer and or Arriola or Camunez will be out there as well, leaving us with potentially a couple more spots in the bullpen that we could fill with youngsters if we do end up moving on from Dora, Gallic, Orozco, and Blanco. So even though we're expecting a lot of potential turnover among our pitching staff that was the best in the American League this year, still feeling like we're going to be putting an excellent pitching staff onto the field next spring. And I think ultimately we're in a similar position with our lineup and our everyday players. Probably going to be moving on from several guys that we're going to be talking about, but feel that we still have enough depth in our organization that we can try to clear some contracts off the books and still hopefully remain one of the top teams in baseball. Jorge Mendoza is going to be an interesting decision. Put up only a 108 WRC plus for us this year, which given his batting profile, I'd say is a little bit of a down year for him. Looking at the course of his career, he's averaged a 120 WRC plus in the majors, so still an above average offensive player, but not as good as he's always been. Looking to be making around $15-16 million next year, so he's getting very expensive. But the combination of an above-average offensive player at catcher, who happens to also have some speed, has some real positive traits in the clubhouse, and is also an excellent defensive catcher, is an extremely appealing combination. Despite a bit of a down year for him offensively, still put up a 4 WAR for us. And, oh yeah, he's been with us 2+ seasons. He's won a couple of World Series with us, and all he did this year was win both the ALCS MVP against his former team, the Twins, and then he won the World Series MVP for us as well. Taking a look at those postseason batting stats, 340 average with 4 homers, drove in 12 runs, scored 12 runs, and had a 189 WRC plus and a WAR of close to 1 in just 16 games played in the postseason. So although we could clear some money by moving on from Mr. Mendoza, right now my inclination is to try to bring him back for one final season behind the plate, even though we do have a very good potential replacement for him that we'll be talking about in just a few moments. Hidetaka Ogata is not a potential replacement for him, but still an outstanding defensive catcher who's almost a perfect backup with that great defense that he brings. Hit 221 this year in 104 at-bats, was barely above replacement level as his outstanding defense basically just more than offset his very poor offense this year. Not expecting a ton from him offensively, but this is a guy who's still making the major league minimum next year and a pretty valuable player with his outstanding defense to have as a backup option. Our starting first baseman most of this year was the rookie Luis Godina, number 93 prospect in baseball, an IAFA signing from almost 8 years ago who has developed well. Hit .313 for us with 31 doubles, 12 homers, 79 ribbies, and 412 at-bats. Put up a 131 WRC plus and a 2.6 WAR for us. Also has that spark plug personality and some good traits in the clubhouse. He ended up only playing for us against left-handed pitchers by the time we got to the playoffs, though. And that's because of Jonah Richards, who ultimately, either next year or more likely the year after, will take over as our starting catcher for Mendoza. But in the meantime, Richards very well could be our first baseman again next year against right-handed pitching. Listed as the number 4 prospect in baseball, had an absolutely monster year in AAA Las Vegas. Brought him up in September, where he pushed the other rookie Godina out of the lineup against righties. And all Richards did for us was hit .345 with 4 homers and 14 ribbies in his first 55 major league at-bats. Put up a WAR of 0.7 for us in that limited playing time. He knows his value, and he's looking for a lot of money, which is why we haven't breached trying to sign him to an extension seriously. But with Mendoza, Ogata, Godina, and Richards in the mix, feeling like our catcher and first base and maybe even potentially DH situation next year is going to be in very good hands. Continuing on with some infielders, Amari Alcindor, an 8th round pick from 2032, is a guy who's developed very well for us. Another very versatile player, can play just about any infield position at a pretty solid level, and also has a bat that we think should be above average. And after a really rough year in 2039 that saw him get sent down to the minors, had a bounce back year for us as a utility infielder this year. Hit .247 in 190 at-bats, but did walk 28 times, also had 12 doubles, and put up a 106 WRC plus and about half a win above replacement in the limited action that he had. Alcindor is signed to a long-term extension with us. As a utility infielder, the numbers that we're paying him aren't too bad the next few years, but probably needs to prove that he can be an everyday player if we're going to have him on the team 5 or 6 years from now when his numbers start getting a bit more expensive. A big part of the reason Alcindor is now a super utility guy for us, in addition to the excellent first baseman we have, we're feeling really good about second base. We signed Chisen Iwata out of Japan as a free agent this past offseason, and he's likely to be the American League Rookie of the Year. Batted .305 for us, scored over 100 runs with 49 doubles, 14 homers, 94 ribbies, also stole 11 bases, put up a 128 WRC plus for us, a WAR of over 5. Another very versatile defensive player who has found a good spot for us as a second baseman and also a pretty good influence in the clubhouse. Our starting third baseman also had a monster year. Last year's American League Rookie of the Year, Juan Pimentel. He followed up his Rookie of the Year season with a season that's likely to see him getting some MVP votes this year. Led the American League with 657 at-bats in 205 hits. Also had 120 runs scored, 42 doubles, 7 triples, 35 homers, stole 12 bases, batted over 300 for the second straight year, 143 WRC plus, and a team best 6.3 WAR for the outstanding third baseman, although he could play second base if we needed him to. Another guy who is just extremely versatile, excellent bat, excellent glove, excellent speed, and he's also durable. Pimentel is a guy that we signed before he had really done anything in the majors to a 10-year, $85 million deal, and there is potential that this contract works out as well for us as the contract with the franchise Jake Ortega did. Our longtime Second baseman Alejandro Landin has been our starting shortstop the last couple years. Turned 30 this year, but the switch hitting shortstop had another really productive offensive season. Scored 100 runs once again, drove in over 100 runs once again after tying for the league lead with 40 homers a year ago, dropped to 22 this year. The batting average of 285 still really solid. Put up a 136 WRC plus and a WAR of close to 4 for us. He's only signed for another couple years at this point, but he's likely to be playing a prominent role on our team while he is still signed. And because we feel so good at second, third, and shortstop with Iwata, Pimentel, and Landin, and we've also got a really good hitting utility infielder who can play all those positions defensively at a pretty high level, could be looking to move on from Andy Toribio this offseason. Have a team option for $3 million left with him. Former starting shortstop for us, moved into a utility role this year. Hit just a $180 and was below replacement level. He actually has pretty good trade value, given that he is a competent hitter who's durable with a really good glove, really good speed. The fans love him. The other players love him in the clubhouse. So he's 33 years old now, and given that it is very conceivable that we don't really have a spot for him. We typically like to run with 2 catchers, 6 infielders, and 5 outfielders. And if we bring back Godina, Richards, Alcinda, Iwata, Pimentel, and Landin, Toribio could very well be the odd man out. And because of that, we may look in very short order to see what we can get for him in a trade. Actually, we've already seen what we can get for him in a trade. And similar to some of the pitchers that we talked about, the likes of Orozco, Blanco, and Gallic. There's some pretty interesting players that we can get for a guy like Andy Toribio. So I think we'll likely be moving on from him before too long. But he has had a really nice run with us, been a member of our last 3 World Championship teams, won the Rookie of the Year in 2034 for us when he was also an All-Star, won a playoff MVP award for a wild card series for us 4 years ago. A guy that we really did well in the trade we picked him up with San Francisco, but could be reaching the end of his run in Oakland at this point. And we may also see some turnover in the outfield as well. One guy that will definitely be back is Darnell Selvey, first-round pick of ours 5 years ago, and he has blossomed into one of the top hitters in baseball. He finished second in the Rookie of the Year voting a year ago behind his teammate Pimentel. Similar to Pimentel, would expect him to be getting some attention for Most Valuable Player this year. Hit 286 with 32 homers, 116 ribbies. Also scored 121 runs, stole 11 bases, a 145 WRC plus, and his 6.3 WAR was just slightly behind what Pimentel put up last year. Selvey is a guy who knows his value. The reason we haven't signed him to an extension is a 10-year extension with him is going to cost about $350 million. So given that he's going to be making the major league minimum next season, and then he'll be getting into his arbitration years, probably a guy who's only going to spend 6 years with us here in Oakland, but we'll try to extract as much excess value as we can out of him over that time period. A more interesting decision for us involves Arturo Uresti, the right fielder who was an IAFA signing of ours over a decade ago. Signed him to a 10-year, $79 million deal, and he's certainly lived up to the deal so far, but this was not a front-loaded deal, and he's going to start making pretty legitimate money as he gets into his late 20s and early 30s. Bounced back from a slow start to have a very solid year for us this year. 250 average, scored 98 runs, 25 homers and 89 ribbies. Led the American League with 115 walks and also stole 18 bases for us. So when all was said and done, he put up a 127 WRC plus, a 5.2 WAR. Another guy very similar to everyone else in the lineup. Solid defensively, good influence in the clubhouse, some good instincts on the base paths, and a good hitter. He's also an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness. We may, or we would consider exploring the trade market for him, but kind of knowing that most of the other guys that we want to deal have some pretty good value in the trade market, and that Uresti is young and very productive. Tend to think he'll be back in right field next year. That combination of Selvey in left and Uresti in right is pretty effective. Steve McIlvaine, picked him up in a trade with the Cubs a year ago, spent most of the year in AAA and was not particularly effective in the major leagues for us. But a left-handed hitter, which we're a little light on, with good speed, a decent bat, competent defensively, and importantly, he still has 2 option years left, so would expect that McIlvaine over the next couple of years will be fighting to be a 5th outfielder for us, and probably some insurance down in the minor leagues at time if he doesn't make the 26-man roster. A guy who we could be moving on from is Sergio Palomares. Spent most of this year as our starting center fielder, hit 248, did have 30 doubles and 39 stolen bases, but just not a lot of pop in the bat, only 2 homers and 47 ribbies. When all was said and done, a 99 WRC plus and a 3.4 WAR. The bat is one of the less impressive bats on our team, but outstanding speed, a very good fielder, a bit of a mixed personality compared to some of our other players, and he's due to be making over $5 million next year in arbitration. Gravedigger Palomares has been a member of our last 3 World Championship teams, was a IAFA signing who has obviously developed pretty well from closing in on 12 years ago at this point. But we could look to move on from Palomares in the not-too-distant future. One other player that I did want to mention, Joe Harmon, also played center field for us this year. Similar to Palomares, pretty good instincts on the base paths, although he doesn't have the same blistering speed as Palomares. Very good defensive outfielder, probably a better influence in the clubhouse than Palomares. Not quite the same type of contact hitter that Palomares is, but a little more pop in his bat. Harmon hit 266 for us this year with 5 homers and 29 ribbies and 184 at-bats, 98 WRC plus and a 1.3 WAR. He's fragile physically, and he ended up being put on the playoff IL when he got injured towards the end of the World Series. But he's a guy who's set to make the major league minimum next year, and if we do move on from Palomares, it's very conceivable that Mayor Harmon will be fighting to be our starting center fielder next year. He's out of options, so he's a guy that we would risk losing if we have to send him back to AAA. I think if we did decide to keep Mr. Palomares for some reason, then we probably would look to trade Harmon. But right now, Palomares also has pretty good value. All of the guys that we're thinking about moving on from to get some salary off of the books have pretty good value in the market right now. So the hope is we can maybe trade a few of them away for an interesting minor league prospect in the next couple of weeks and maybe get someone who can ultimately help us in the majors as well. Last, but certainly not least, however, is the franchise, Jake Ortega, who is a player we picked in the first round, 3rd overall in 2029 out of Oregon State. And Mr. Ortega, affectionately known as the franchise, has had a really nice 10-year run with us in the major leagues. Unfortunately, that run may be coming to an end. He's now 33 years old. He's wrecked physically, and he's looking for $27.5 million over 6 years, taking him into his late 30s. I just don't know if that's a prudent contract for us to offer. But Ortega has been a member of 3 World Series championship teams with us, 2-time MVP, Rookie of the Year, won a Gold Glove, perennial All-Star, 3-time Silver Slugger, and he has at this point won 5 playoff series MVP awards, including most recently the ALDS just a few weeks ago when he hit a big walk-off homer for us to clinch a important victory for our squad against the Chicago White Sox. Although Ortega moved into a DH role this year to try to keep him healthy, he was still productive offensively. He had missed over 100 games 2 of the past 3 years, and given his age and his injury proneness, we wanted to try to keep his bat in the lineup. And the 602 at-bats that he had with us were the most that he's ever had in his career. 63 steals, which led the American League, which were also a career high for him. And 38 doubles, 6 triples, and 22 home runs in 149 games. When you look at his 162 game averages of 45 doubles, 7 triples, and 24 homers, to go with 92 ribbies versus the 91 that he had, and 112 runs scored versus the 110 runs he had, his counting stats were basically same as it ever was for Jake Ortega. The areas where he did fall off a bit, his batting average dropped by about 40 points from a year ago to 264. And you can see his OPS went down to 807, which is the worst of his career in a full season. Still put up a 3.7 WAR for us, but given his age, given that he's wrecked physically, and given that he's looking for a lot of years for a guy in his mid-30s, and a lot of money for a team that's already way over its budget, it'll probably be time for us to let Ortega move on this offseason. Certainly we'll give him a qualifying offer to get some compensation in return, but the 2-time American League MVP, who's led the American League in WAR in each of his MVP seasons, is extremely popular, as you would expect. And we're certainly going to take a big hit to fan interest if we move on from Ortega. A bit of a bummer that after close to a decade in the majors with us, the franchise may not conclude his career with us. I think ultimately the Hall of Fame voters are going to have a real interesting decision with Ortega when all is said and done. Hope that he signs a 5 or 6 year contract and he's healthy for most of that time and he can continue putting up numbers. But honestly, it's going to be a real interesting case because my hunch is he's going to be in and out of the lineup a lot over the next 3, 4, 5 years. I think it's going to be rare for him to be playing 150 games a season. Probably going to have as many seasons where he's playing 120 games or 60 games, which represent 3 of his last 5 years. His counting stats are not going to be exceptional. He should get to 1,000 runs. Probably will get to 2,000 hits, but he's not going to get to 300 home runs. I think he probably gets to 1,000 ribbies. Probably gets to 400 stolen bases. Not that that's necessarily a magical number in baseball history, but based on what he did this year, I think it's very conceivable he loses his 300 career batting average over the next 4 or 5 years as well. 53 WAR for his career, and as I mentioned, a 2-time MVP who's also led the league in doubles, WAR a couple times, and stolen bases a couple times. It's going to be an interesting call for him. Multiple MVPs who are not in the Hall of Fame are very rare. Obviously, Barry Bonds and Alex Rodriguez should be based on what they did on the field, but are not based on what they did in the clubhouse or the trainer's room. I think the only other 2-time MVPs in Major League history who aren't in the Hall of Fame, though, are Roger Maris, Dale Murphy, and Juan Gonzalez. So Ortega, I think, conceivably could end up in that type of company as a multiple-time MVP who just comes up a little short in some of the counting stats as far as the Hall of Fame. I think it's ultimately going to come down to health with the franchise. If he signs a 6-year deal and he's healthy for 4 or 5 of those 6 years, although he is certainly declining at this point, still is above average in everything batting wise, everything speed wise, everything outfield wise. But he certainly is deteriorating at this point. You look at his ratings at the start of spring training, and he's lost 5 points in contact. He's lost 5 to 10 points in eye from earlier this year. Not as good defensively. So it's possible that even if he signs a 5 or 6 year contract, he's only got maybe another 2 healthy years ahead of him. And if he really only has 2 full seasons because of injuries to continue accumulating statistics, I do think there is a chance that Mr. Ortega won't ultimately make it to the Hall of Fame. I'm also a little concerned that whoever picks him up is going to be not as conservative as we were this year playing him at DH, and want to extract some of that defensive value from him in the outfield, which could likely lead to a higher likelihood of him getting injured and not being able to kind of put up the stats that he might otherwise. Definitely a bummer that the switch-hitting outfielder is unlikely to be with us for the long term, but we feel like we've gotten incredible value out of the player that we picked 3rd overall the last time we had a really high draft pick. We signed him before he had ever had anything but a cup of coffee in the majors to a 9-year, $47.5 million deal. We signed him to that deal after he hit a $155 in his first 58 at-bats. And for the $47.5 million that he's made over the last 9 years, put up a WAR of over 53. So less than $1 million per point of WAR that Ortega has put up for us, which has certainly been a fantastic investment for the Oakland A's. And he's obviously a huge part of the reason that we have won 3 of the last 5 World Series titles. And although everything ultimately worked out well for us with Ortega playing DH, the platoon of Palomares and Harmon at center field for us this year, we did entertain moving on from Palomares for some other center fielders. And loyal viewer and frequent commenter Peter Hooper asked for us to check in on what a couple of the guys that we were thinking about trading for right before the trade deadline ended up doing. Interestingly, along with Ortega in center field, both of the guys that we looked at are going to be free agents this year and are looking for significantly less money than Ortega. Walker Jenkins, 35-year-old wrecked left-handed hitting outfielder for the Marlins organization, was a guy that we had a trade in principle agreed to in early July. And by the time we revisited things with the Marlins, Jenkins did not want to waive his 10-5 rights, so we ultimately couldn't get anything done with him. Ended up having 454 at-bats for the Marlins this year, 102 WRC plus and a 3.1 WAR. Did steal 17 bases, hit 16 homers, was a slightly above average offensive player when all was said and done. His speed and his skill in the outfield allowed him to put up that 3 WAR. Look at what he did over the last couple months of the season. Hit just 221 in August, and then just 269 over 26 at-bats in the month of September. Assuming that means that he got hurt down the stretch. Yeah, looks like a strained ab in September. He did play 6 games, so it looks like he tried to play through it for a while, but it was a 3 to 4 week injury. So maybe he played the first couple days in September and then came back at the end of the month. Looks like he would have likely been healthy for the playoffs for us. Again, we won without him, so there was no need in retrospect to trade for him, but our big fear with Jenkins was that if we were playing him in center field every day, he'd get hurt. And it looks like he did miss 3 to 4 weeks with an injury with the Marlins late in the season. The other guy that we thought about was the left-handed outfielder Kamani Ibekwe. Had for him a very rough year with San Diego this year, a 73 WRC plus and he was barely above replacement level despite good defense and good speed. Stole 37 bases, but just 12 homers and 54 ribbies for him. So the offense really fell off. He is a durable guy, which we liked about him compared to Jenkins. And you can see he ended up playing 154 games, so it doesn't seem like there was anything too significant, assuming that his injury situation in San Diego would have translated perfectly to what we experienced in Oakland, which obviously isn't accurate, but seems like Ibekwe would have been able to at least be in the lineup consistently for us over the last couple months of the season. But again, since we ended up winning the World Series with the Palomares and Harmon duo in center field, can't complain about the way everything ended up here this year for Oakland. And with that, we have one last thing to do before we are going to finish off this episode, and that is make one of the trades that we were talking about. As I mentioned when we shopped a lot of the players that we are considering moving on for, pretty positive reaction. We're not going to get the next Jake Ortega or Juan Pimentel for any of them, I don't think. But there's definitely some interesting major leaguers that we can get for them and some younger major leaguers who are really kind of prospects. And there was one guy that we were able to pick up in a trade for just about any of these players that we're going to make a deal for right now. And that player is Chris Chatty Lance, a left-handed hitting 26-year-old first baseman in the Atlanta Braves organization. Would give us another lefty hitter in the lineup. And the way I'm thinking about the 26-year-old Chance, has not done much in the majors thus far. Came up this year in September, it looks like. Hit .327 with 4 homers and 13 ribbies and 52 at-bats, so was incredibly productive. But a guy who was a first-round pick out of Georgia in 2037, seems like it took him a little while as he was making his major league debut just before his 26th birthday. That said, he's durable. He's a left-handed hitter who we think could definitely help our power numbers against right-handed pitching. High work ethic and intelligence. Not a lot of speed, not that great defensively, but he's a competent defensive first baseman. And importantly, he's a guy with 2 option years left. I know it seems odd to potentially be picking up a player with this profile and not necessarily thinking that they're going to be on the major league roster next year. But my thought is if we have Mendoza at catcher next year, Richards is likely locked in at first base. And Mr. Lance, unfortunately, doesn't really look like he's capable playing anywhere except first base or DH. Could certainly be in the mix to be DH for us next year. But he's also a guy who we could have spend most of the year in the minors and then bring up in September to give the offense a boost, similar to what we did with Richards this year. And then the thought would be that if we do end up keeping Mendoza at catcher this year, this upcoming 2041 season, in 2042, Richards moves behind the plate, and in 2042, Lance takes over as our full-time first baseman. So I think he's a pretty interesting guy to think about, and as I mentioned, a lot of the guys that we were thinking on moving on from, we can pick up for Lance straight up. It's a pretty select list, but the reliever, Daniel Blanco, the starting pitcher, Mike Gallick, as well as the longtime utility infielder, Andy Toribio, are all guys that we can trade to Atlanta and pick Lance up for. I think Toribio broadly has a little less trade value than certainly Gallick and also Blanco. So we are going to trade away our longtime starting shortstop, who's become a utility infielder for us, Andy Toribio. As I talked about, I think it's hard for me to find a roster spot for Toribio next year, rather than paying the $300,000 buyout to decline his team option. Pick up what we can for him, and we get another guy who's going to be in the mix, who we'd probably rather have on the team given his bat than Toribio next year anyways, even though Toribio's defensive versatility and strength defensively is different than what we're dealing with for Lance. I think this is a great trade that we need to make now in case it goes away. Sometimes you sim forward a day and the trade just isn't there anymore. I think we could get Lance, certainly for the pitcher Gallic, and possibly for Blanco going forward. I'm not so sure that the Toribio deal is always going to be out there for us. So it looks like, Atlanta is, from following us over the last few years, has been a very strong team, usually in the playoffs. They've got one of the great two-way players in the history of baseball in Mike Ramsey. So they're a win-now team. They might have an opening at second base or shortstop that they need to fill, and they think Toribio can help them remain competitive next year. I think Lance can help us remain competitive, not just next year, but hopefully 5, 6, 7 years into the future, with the fact that he's got very minimal major league service at this point. A little bit of a bummer that Atlanta is negative cash situation at this point, because normally trading with a team like that, I'd love to have them throw in a little more cash. Doesn't really look like they're willing to throw in a useful prospect at all with Lance, so it looks like they view that as a pretty even deal. And we are going to go ahead and complete the trade, bring Lance on board for Toribio. The fans not happy. We knew that could potentially happen. Fortunately, Lance will offset a little bit of the points we lose in fan interest moving on from Toribio. Still at 100 or above, even with that move, opened up another $3 million for us. So builds a little bit of financial flexibility into the organization. And again, I think Lance is a left-handed hitting first base DH type with slightly above average contact, well above average home run power, and a slightly above average eye. Can be a pretty interesting bat in the middle of our lineup for the coming years. And he does kind of put us in a situation with Richards on board where we can confidently move on from Mendoza a year from now, when he's going to be looking for a massive free agent contact, pivot Richards into the catcher role, and then potentially put Lance right into that first base role. So don't love moving on from a guy who's been really important for our team. As I mentioned, Toribio, former Rookie of the Year, great value that he's delivered, 3-time World Series champion with us. But to get a 26-year-old with 2 years of minor league options left, who we think can be a really good offensive player, durable, a guy who's a former first-round draft pick, just felt like this was a trade that we were not even going to sim forward one day in case the opportunity to get Lance for Toribio was something that Atlanta had second thoughts about. And with that, we will call it an episode. Next time, we will take a look at our minor league system, check in on some of our former players, some of the top prospects in baseball. I'm sure some of you will have some thoughts about our high-level plan for the offseason that we've talked about so far, and some of the guys we might be moving on from. Sure, some of you may have some thoughts on the trade we just executed as well. Always interesting and helpful to hear what you are thinking. So hope to keep the conversation going. As always, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.